Hello and welcome to the One Life Church devotional series where we cover the entire Bible in 20 months. Well, today's Psalms are Psalm 77 and 78. Now, these are reasonably similar in their structure and their big lesson, their big idea. So let's start with Psalm 78. This is the second longest psalm in the whole Bible, and it is definitely the longest historical psalm. And so basically, the lesson from Psalm 78 is that the lesson from history is that history must not repeat itself. And so basically he says, verse 4, we will not hide them from our descendants. We're not going to hide the lessons we've learned from our descendants. Verse 6 says, they would in turn tell their children and not forget his deeds. And so this is the basic outline. God saved Israel from Egypt and gave them water in the desert. That's from Psalm 9 through to Psalm 16. And God gave his people food in the desert, but they still did not obey him. That takes us right through to verse 31. And the people are not really sorry from 32 through to 39. The people do not remember what God did in Egypt. He did miraculous things in Egypt, but they sort of like hardened their hearts. Verse 56, but they put God to the test and rebelled against the Most High. They did not keep his statutes, and that angered God. So he takes this whole lesson of Israel and he brings them right up to the time of David. And it says here in verse 65 onwards, God made Judah leader instead of Ephraim. So he sidestepped Joseph's tribe and he went straight to Judah. And he chose David, as it says in verse 70, his servant, and took him from the sheep pens. Now, one of the most profound verses in all of Psalms is the very last verse in Psalm 78. And David shepherded them with integrity of heart and skillful hands he led them. And a beautiful picture of a shepherd with integrity of heart. David was pretty much what you got. He wasn't, apart from when he sinned with Bathsheba, essentially he was an open book. And so he shepherded his people with honesty, a rawness about him, an integrity of heart and skillful hands. For us, when we lead, that's what we want. Integrity in heart and skill in our hands. Now, Psalm 77 has got a pretty similar theme. The psalmist says, I was too troubled to speak. Has God forgotten me? And then he says in verse 11, but I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember the miracles of long ago. Verse 12, I will consider all your works and meditate on your mighty deeds. And then the very last verse says, and you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. So both these psalms reflect on a present predicament and the need to remember the goodness of God and the deeds of God and the power of God. And it seems to have an impact on how you lead. And so he says, so he led them through Aaron's hand and Moses' hand. And I suppose, in the previous psalm, we saw David's integrity of heart and skillful hands. When we remember God's deeds, when we remember God's nature, when we remember in the midst of turmoil, the nature of our God, it affects how we lead, how we parent, how we shepherd, how we look after people. That's the big takeaway for me from these two psalms. If we forget God's nature, forget the lessons we've learned, forget his power, forget the way God can go, then we start leading like the rest of the world. And woe betide those that we're trying to lead. Anyway, as you plow through that very long psalm, I trust that as you reflect on Israel's history and God's intervention and how they forgot him and took him for granted, that we would not make the same mistake.